Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both together. May our study be fruitful and vigorous. May everything else, all our normal life, be fruitful and vigorous too. May we not unnecessarily cover with each other. And peace, peace, peace be unto all. So we are continuing the study of the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18. And we now commence with the 30th stanza. And this is to do with buddhi. This is to do with the intellect. We have to explain, as we may have done previously, the structure of the mind according to the Sankhya psychology. We can think of it something like a reception office. So a message comes to the reception office on the ground floor, delivers a message. That is, the report is given of the environment. And the message is earmarked for a certain department. So the mind takes it. Mind meaning a certain department which we call manasa, a kind of reception and reaction area that deals with all our impressions. And it takes it to the right department, but ultimately it's got to go to an executive officer who analyzes and sees what the message says and then makes a decision. A wonderful example can be given of this. So supposing I'm standing in a field, some object is rushing toward me. Now we have to bear in mind that from an idealist philosophy point of view, what is in front is unknown and unknowable. We think that we know what's in front. We think it's a table, chair, and all the rest of it. We think it's the sky. We think a bird is flying. We think a tree is growing. But when you really analyze it, aside from the limitation of the sense organs, it is an unknown factor. Science has discovered it in a kind of wavy, nebulous kind of form and deemed it to be something like a field. This being unknown and unknowable, we have to register it with a certain instrument, internal instrument, antakarana, and from there we determine from our experience and our memory what it is. And then the external, which we'll label as an X, encounters a Y called the mind, and then the interaction creates the world in front of us. The Sankhya philosophers understood this and knew this. To that extent, they were idealists. So they understood that there's a registration. In a field, something unknown is happening. All these movements get reported to the mind. Mind says something is moving and registers it from a memory. It is a bull. It looks very angry. And that gets reported to a component in the mind called ego. It is running at me. And this gets reported to the intellect, which then decides it is time probably to run and find a tree and climb up it. So this is seen to be the sequence of events, but all the time some observer is there observing these activities. And this is variously called Atman or Purusha, the two terms that at the end of the day mean the same, but are very rich in their internal meaning. Atman simply means self. It is the ultimate self. Once you take off the shell called the body, once you take off the subtle body called mind, once you take off intellect, once you take off agency and all the rest of it, all these things you take off, you're left with one man standing, as it were, one entity standing. And that doesn't change. In eternal witness, it doesn't get involved in the activity. This principle we have to rehearse time and time and time again, until we can assert in truth, I am that, or thou art that, tattvamasi. These kinds of brahmasmi, these kinds of statements, these great mahavakyas contained in the Vedas or the Upanishads. We can say them glibly, but as long as we feel embodiment, or feel that we are embodied, feel that we are a set of molecular patchworks called the body, then we have no real right to assert this, because it's not the truth from our relative standpoint. So we have to get used to the principle and get close to it in moments of inspiration. Inspiration are things which flash effortlessly within us, and they are there due to a cleansing of the mind, a preparation of the mind for such a revelation. So all along in this Bhagavad Gita, and particularly here in chapter 18, we've been following the Sankhya principles of three evolutionary forces that we call gunas, the things that seem to bind us and hold the universe together. These forces hold the universe together. This is the Sankhya physics. And every system takes up the same thing. So that Shankaracharya comments that with regard to the science of the gunas, the Sankhya's are the experts. Of course, we disagree with their final conclusions. At the time of this Bhagavad Gita, Vyasa, inspired by Krishna and so on, must have understood it was necessary that we reconcile all these different schools of thought. And so this word Sankhya is used repeatedly. And here we find the whole process, the whole geography of the mind being laid out for us, and how the sequence of events goes inward, and how our reaction goes outward, like breathing in, breathing out. And all creatures have this arrangement: information coming in, a processing, and a reaction going out. But the decisive factor in it is buddhi. And this buddhi as an intellect, as a fully developed intellect, only man has. This gives man an advantage. It gives him the capacity for you to sit and listen and sort out what is being said in a reasonable way, to rationalize it. Don't forget, the process toward understanding will be listening and hearing, and then to see, is this a reasonable thing? Does it conform with some kind of logic? And to contemplate what the various levels and layers of meanings might be. And then nididhyasana, finally to meditate on this and have this inner meaning revealed as it was revealed in the beginning. So the importance of these three gunas, as I mentioned before, are that we take this binding element that we call sattva and use it as our tool. In terms of the psychological processing, we learn to see things in a positive way. And positivity in this context means a non-pain-bearing way. Non-pain-bearing because later on we'll find how these three gunas relate to the subject of happiness. Happiness and joy is something everybody is striving for. Perfection, power, happiness, joy. These are the three things that everybody is striving for in their own way. But we are pulled, and the pull comes from desires. Yesterday, we celebrated the United Nations Peace Day with other members of other religious communities. But of course, all religions and all revealers of religions really say the same thing in different language, that renunciation is necessary. Renunciation of what? Letting go of desires. What are desires? A sense of unfulfillment, some hollow perceived in me that I feel I can fulfill from the outside, that will make me happy. But we know that it doesn't. Of course, it gives some temporary happiness, some temporary pleasure, there's no doubt about it. But it is followed by a hollow. And it is the hollow that in some way urges us to a repetition unless we have the wisdom to get out of it. And that wisdom is supplied by these shastras, these scriptures, teachers, mystics, and so on, who know there is a different way out. The formula of fighting and running away and yielding can be replaced with an attitude of love, the higher qualities and virtues. And this has a cleansing effect in the mind. And so the mind is seen, according to the yoga philosophy, as a kind of pond, a kind of lake with many, many disturbances in it. Patanjali, the great stalwart and great authority on the philosophy of yoga, in his sutra literature, describes these disturbances in the lake of the mind as vrittis, vortexes, whirlpools, waves, things which muddy up the whole perception and clarity of the water. You can imagine now a lake with all these various disturbing forces, and the bottom all stirred up, like mud, all stirred up. And even the waves gives us distorted visions, no matter how clear the water is. So imagine muddy, impure, unclarified, disturbed water. And that is due to two waves. It is due to these waves which are egocentric waves. And this is called rajas and tamas. Psychologically speaking, rajas is connected with activity, egocentric activity, fulfilling desires. And tamas has a technique, a person imbued with tamas, which says, let us leave everything alone. Let us just stop everything. Let us not react. Let us be lazy. Let us not go anywhere. Let us not change. Let us not evolve. Let us not move forward. Let us maintain at all costs our status quo. And let us sink ourselves down into ignorance and darkness. So these two varieties of the waves, rajas and tamas, activity and inertia, are the things which clash and muddy up our understanding. They create for us layers of ignorance so that we are unable to see the self-evident truth, like we're unable to see the bottom of the lake. Sattva is another wave. By introducing the sattvic wave, it acts as a counter wave. Its characteristic is it has no sense of I, me, mine. It is completely selfless. And in this thought, word, and deed, having this characteristic has the effect of neutralizing these waves and creating a calmness and a clarity, a condition in the mind whereby revelation becomes self-evident. The self reveals itself from within, effortlessly. It is just a question of cleaning. And we use sattva, we use sattvic thought. Many times I've mentioned before, at the risk of repetition, I say again, we can take it philosophically like a kind of game, a game of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And whenever we see a wave of rajas or tamas within a time framework, we understand that it cannot last. It can only come as a wave. It finds it's a point of awareness where we notice it and goes off. And it wants to linger. And our friendship with it wants it to linger if we're not careful. We want to replay all the childish events of the past. Having noticed it and not trying to repress or change it, a psychologically devastating thing to do, we allow it to come momentarily within the time frame. We treat it like an old friend, since it is there from our childhood probably, in our psyche. Deep down in our unconscious mind, we had to form a behavior that seemed to serve us well, was an old friend in childhood. But since we now matured into adulthood, it not only is of no use to us or value to us, but it endangers us. It's a robber. It robs us of our freedom. Now, just as if you're confronted with a robber in your house and you have the courage to face that robber, not aggressively, but talk to the person nicely. You see, this is the foundation of Valmiki's Ramayana. Valmiki was originally a robber, and Narada came his way, and a conversation ensued where they talked to each other nicely. And then we have this great sage, Valmiki, coming out from this. Another story we can relate with the Holy Mother, Sharada Devi, visiting Sri Ramakrishna, and she lags behind the others and gets left behind and loses her way and gets beset upon by two robbers, husband and wife. And immediately she sees them, she recognizes the divine within them and calls them father, mother, I've lost my way, maybe you can help. Instead of robbing her or harassing her or doing her harm, they served as an escort all the way and became devotees. So in the face of the enemy, talking nicely, they say, please come if you like. I have no objection to you. I recognize you. Please come. You were there with me in kindergarten. Come if you want. Stay if you can. Have a cup of tea. Go if you must. And if you insist on staying, I have to tell you, no. You had your cup of tea and now you're gone. I have new friends. What are these new friends? These higher values, strength and beauty, goodness, love and harmony, they can all come in and fill your seconds in this way. Filling the mind in this way gives you a buffer against all the negative reactions that you may come across in the future. So this is why these gunas are emphasized. But the deciding factor is this intellect, is this buddhi. One of enlightened intellect is a Buddha. Our aim is to make the buddhi clarified with the sattvic quality so that this clarity may be available in the mind itself. And so the 30th stanza begins like this. Of course, the 29th stanza was an introductory stanza. It basically, Buddha bhidam dritish chaiva gunatas triyudam shranu prochamanam asheshina pratatvena dhananjaya. Here, the threefold distinction of understanding and also firmness, we will deal only with understanding at this point, according to the gunas. And he's going to explain them exhaustively. Exhaustively, meaning so important, you need to understand this thoroughly. So buddhi, or understanding, is the faculty of distinguishing between right and wrong, good and bad, the real, the unreal, the permanent, the impermanent, things which are useful, things which are useless, and making a determination and an executive decision. If you want to know what is tapas, what is austerity? Austerity is strengthening the buddhi, that is, strengthening the willing side, so that we can be firm in our resolve. And that is why firmness also is mentioned. Let's deal with first this buddhi, this understanding. And in this context, Sri Ramakrishna told a story, and that dolls come in various forms and so on, dolls made of sugar, and this we mentioned last week. So let us begin with this first stanza, and we'll find that moral dilemmas of ethics, morality, right and wrong, get resolved in these subsequent stanzas. Pravritim cha nivritim cha karya karye payabhe bandam moksham chaya vidhi buddhi sa partha sattiki. A very curious term is mentioned here. Pravritim, the path of work. The intellect, which knows the paths of work and renunciation, right and wrong, action, fear and fearlessness, bondage and liberation, that intellect, O Partha, is sattvika. Let's take this term pravriti. Pravriti is the so-called normal working, waking life. That is working toward a certain end. Entanglement in earthly life, we have these two paths. Remember earlier, we have these two paths. We have the path of Shreyas and Nishreyas, right and wrong, a direction that leads us toward freedom and one which inhibits us. Don't forget, our goal is freedom. Our goal is moksha. Freedom from what? Freedom from pain, freedom from difficulties, freedom from obstacles. Not by squashing them or removing them, but finding a nice way around them through a sattvic attitude. But it begins with this discernment. We have to have an attitude which understands and knows what is real, what is unreal. Now, Vedanta is very simple in its principles. Its third principle, having said that there is only one existence, says that all these variegated things, all this variation is nothing more than mithya. It is simply waves that come and go. And all Eastern philosophy agrees on this one thing, that this whole world is something like a flux. It is changing. And it is made from parts in space. These assemblage of parts called aggregates. Everything is an aggregate and will therefore fall apart. Now, if you ask what is the importance then of body, life, and death, it is not as important as we deem it to be. So, when we lay out a drama, such as we find in the Mahabharata, and the Bhishma is there, and we ask, is he fighting on the wrong side? Did he make a wrong decision? In the grand scheme of things, it has nothing to do with death. That was said up front in this very Bhagavad Gita, right in the very first instance of the Lord's teaching. We are grieving for those who should not be grieved for. Now, the biggest pain that we have, humanly speaking, would be bereavement. The threat of a loss of life. And the dying person has more to lose than the living one. Don't forget, a person on his or her deathbed is not just losing one person, is losing the whole family, multiple people, friends, relatives, bank account, property. All of that is gone. And so in bereavement counseling, the dying gets counseling because it's a departure. But the interesting thing is that on departure, that is, when a person dies, invariably, not always, but invariably, well, I say invariably, most times, the person on the verge recognizes, accepts, and resigns to the fact that letting go moment is a blessed moment. All beings are born, all beings live, all beings die. This was a very central theme laid out by Sri Krishna in the second chapter. And so why should it be a surprise to us? And yet this is the paradox that is mentioned when Yudhishthira is confronted by a ghost, an inhabiting spirit of a lake, when the Pandavas are getting very thirsty, and many questions are being asked. The primary question, what is that most paradoxical thing in human nature? And quite rightly, it's answered that we find death all around us. But we fear we'll live forever. We don't consider it. We put it as a skeleton in the closet, in the unconscious mind. We leave it in the shadow and don't attend to it. We don't face it. Death is a taboo subject. Actually, in this modern age, God and death, we might say three: God, death, and politics. These are all taboo subjects. Politics we can understand. Religion, yes, religion we can understand, but discussion of God we cannot understand. It's worth the investigation. We don't have to call it God, of course, if you don't like that term. If it comes with too much baggage for you, call it something else. But make the investigation. This whole Bhagavad Gita is a text on investigation. What is the nature of reality? And it is only this buddhi, this determinative faculty, that will determine for us what is real, what is unreal. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, that famous prayer, Asato ma satgamaya, see. So lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from this dark area to the light area. Lead us from death to immortality. The reason why we are so frightened of dying is because we do not know that we live eternally. So it is only this refined intellect that we catch it. And the normal situation, the normal concern that we have is we don't exercise this discernment, and we live and act as if normal living is devoid of death, devoid of sorrow. We paint a rosy picture, rose-tinted glasses. This is how we're normally looking at the world. But we have an alternative. And the alternative is mentioned here, renunciation. And that is the English interpretation, but it is called nivritti. We can say pravritti, nivritti. Don't forget that Patanjali Yoga Sutras has as its second sutra, it has yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha. Let all these waves cease. What we call yoga, the technique of controlling the mind, is the restraining of chitta, the mind stuff. And the mind stuff is the stuff there that erupts into waves. These waves we are trying to control, not by repressing, not by attacking, not by confronting, not by adjusting or changing, but by promoting another kind of wave. And so this wave is what the buddhi, intellect, is promoting. We can only do this by what we can translate as renunciation. Renunciation of what? We already discovered. Renunciation of attachment. Attachment to oneself and everything related to oneself. All people, places, events, and objects that we relate to. And detachment is there on the one side, but a reality is there on the other side. That is, I stand in my pristine glory as this one Atman. When I make this kind of renunciation, not only of attachment, but also the fruits of all these activities, then this is right understanding. And then fear. Fear and fearlessness. We conduct our lives normally by making a psychological swing between fear and fearlessness. But who is free from fear? So most people suffer because of unnecessary fear. Fear comes from a ghost in the future that has not arrived, or a ghost in the past that arrived, and we chew it over and revamp it unnecessarily. And so what should we fear? Our primary fear is the fear of death. How can we overcome this fear of death? How can we make ourselves fearless? It is only by this understanding that the buddhi has, that death, as we call it, is but a comma, not a full stop. It is part and parcel of an inevitable, endless cycle. Cosmologically, it happens. Locally, it happens. An axiom according to this philosophy is that what happens on the small scale, microcosmic scale, will happen on the great cosmic scale. The great macrocosm is just a repetition of it. So when there is birth, life, and death here, the birth, life, and death is there in the cosmos too. And this has been gone through in previous chapters as well. If there is only one without a second, if there are no other entities, if there's no other, no second, then who will be fearful of who? But that's the truth of it. It is only when we try to earmark individualities, fragments, segments, parts, and we try as individuals to relate to that, that fear comes in, uncertainty comes in. On the devotional level, should we not trust in the fullness of God? Should we not trust in nature? Nature is our word for God in manifestation. Should we not trust that all things are working well? Should we not trust, to use a biblical phrase, God made the world and saw that it was good? Can we not see that? Previously, we did a meditation using simply a tree. Can we not see the glory in that and be confident about it? Do we think that when we look at the tree will get frightened and fall down? The tree and nature has its own rhythm, and it is all well designed according to a certain harmony. Why should we doubt it? Why should we doubt ourselves? Why should we doubt ourselves, the inner core of which is that Lord of the universe sitting there? And how should we doubt the whole of the universe, which is nothing more than that entity, seeming to be fragmented here and there? See, it is only by an enlightened intellect that we understand these things. It is only by using this intellect and making it increasingly sattvic. And bear in mind that sattva, rajas, and tamas can alternate. But to make sattva steady, that's the key. So if we understand the difference and the distinction between fear and fearlessness, then also of what is bondage and liberation. There are people all over the world fighting for freedom. But what does this freedom mean? It is freedom to have a house, freedom to have some security somewhere. In some cases, freedom to breathe free of political oppression. So people are keen to have these freedoms, and in Western countries, the individuality is so emphasized. There is freedom of speech to the point where people are pretty much allowed to say what they like and get away with it. And when they're contested, they say, oh, we have freedom of speech. We are entitled to, it's our democratic right. But you see, isn't that going too far? Don't forget in the 17th chapter, what was sattvic speech? What was tapas in terms of physical speech and the mind? This is how it is laid out. Speech should be elevating to another, should be beneficent. We should be the mouthpiece of joy. We should elevate another person's mind along with us, not bring it down, not making it depressed. Is that loving? You find people in a relationship like that. See, at the altar, they may say, I love you. At the ceremony, they love you. And then after a few months or so, they get in an argument and they say, oh, by the way, I no longer love you. You're not the man I married, or you're not the woman I married. Well, who was it then? I don't know. So we find all kinds of excuses because we never saw things in the right perspective. This freedom that we're talking about is lasting freedom, and you'll only find it in your own nature. When something is there, never changes, and is constant, then that is truly free. And the rest is faith in heredity, What is fear? Faith in heredity. That's all. And what is the opposite? Fearlessness? A faith in God. Faith in God as a companion, if you're a devotee, faith in God as your lover, as your closest confidant, or in other systems, faith in the ever-flowing pouring of the essence in and through everything, through all hands, all arms, all eyes, all feet, all heads. Either way, faith is necessary. And so this is all called sattvika, quite naturally. This is the characteristics of the sattva buddhi, and by laying this out, naturally, we would all like to have that. So now, Sri Ramakrishna has this to say. This particular version of the Bhagavad Gita has the advantage of having these relevant statements from Sri Ramakrishna inserted. Is this world unreal? He says. He poses a question like that. It is unreal as long as you have not realized Ishvara or God. For you do not recognize his presence in the things worldly. You didn't see it. But wherever you look is God dressed up. The intellect that understands and knows this will get freedom. The feeling of I and mine has gone deep into you. Therefore, you have become bound to the world. You are drowning yourself increasingly in the ocean of samsara, desperately trying to, you might extend the example, desperately trying to gasp for air, bringing up to the surface and drowning again. Though the path of liberation is easy and straight, you think the path of liberation is difficult? No, it is easy and straight. It is simple. The simple fact is, you are that. You don't have to look for it. It's not something that will come in a post-mortem reality. It is not something that will come. You're here already. So, though the path of liberation is easy and straight, delusion has covered your eyes, and so you knock about here and there like a blind man. And the Kathopanishad and others will tell you of the example of a blind leading the blind and both falling into the ditch. You know that samsara is impermanent. Ponder over the house you live in. Now, what house do you live in? I had a discussion this afternoon with somebody grieving. The sister had cancer and also the COVID virus and so on. And but even after several months, naturally, humanly speaking, the person will grieve. Sri Krishna says you are grieving. Only the wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead. Then why are we grieving? Are you encouraging us not to go through the bereavement process? No, I'm not. Because you're not wise. But if you're wise, you won't find any necessity for it. But humanly speaking, us foolish people will grieve. So grieving over what? Our error is to think that the person has gone forever and life is meaningless, and it starts making us question about our own meaning and our own life, which is a good thing, if steered in the right way. If it leads us to a reevaluation of what house are we living in? We're living in a house that is made from whatever you ate yesterday, whatever it is, potato and soup and, if you're lucky, idli and, dosha and all that, fine. But that's all it is. So ponder over the house you live in. Shankaracharya is very graphic in his description of what the human body is. It's made from filth. It's made from pulsing blood and, things like that, bone marrow. It's made from all kinds of things that you don't suspect. We only have a general view of the body, and nature has designed it in such a way that either looks very nice or not, according to our taste. But look at it carefully, and you'll see it's something very different. Millions and trillions of bacteria reside on every square inch of your skin. Bacteria resides in your gut. Your whole body is labored with mucus, and see all of these kinds of things. When you make an account of the body's makeup, you'll come to a conclusion. It is a wonderful working machine. But like every machine, you take a car, for example, it's a wonderful thing when it runs. But don't think that it is clean. It requires cleaning, but it runs on oil and grease and dirty things. Same thing with the human body. Everyone is walking around and sitting with their own inner septic tank. Never forget it. When the body goes, it's only the body. Finished. So, how many have been born and how many have died in it? The dwelling place in the saints, meaning the world itself, the earth, this planet. Worldly things appear in a trice before you, and they disappear too in a trice. Those whom you hold as your kith and kin are not so after you die. Still, how deep is man's attachment to the world? Though nobody at home is dependent on an old man, he finds no time to go to Benares. He gets no leisure for devotional practices. What will become of my dear grandson, Harisa, if I do not look after him, says he, and gets attached to the child. This is the deplorable way of the worldly man. Now, don't be too despondent. This realization you get glimpse by glimpse. Of course, if you're lucky, you'll get it in a flash. But this is not meant to make you feel despondent. It's there to make you a realist. And then to use your intellect in such a way that increasingly you'll learn the art of discernment, discrimination. Yaya dharmam adharmam cha, karyam eva cha, yajatavat prajanati buddhihi sa partha rajasi. The intellect that makes a distorted grasp of dharma and adharma, of what ought to be done and what ought not to be done, that, O Partha, is rajasika. Let us have a look at this. Sometimes we have a self-justified philosophy that says the ends justify the means, or the means justify the end. There are many examples of this, but we put into the category of morality what is in fact not exactly moral, but we make a moral justification for it. An immoral thing would have been for Arjun to walk away from this war. And in the drama that is the war, we could say many things have happened. Let us take, for example, Yudhishthira. It was Duryodhana that thought it was a moral thing, a right thing, to induce or entice Yudhishthira into gambling. And gambling is clearly wrong. And then with all this bloodshed that took place. So that's where it begins, actually. Of course, it begins even further back in the resentment of childhood and so on and so forth, all of those kinds of things. But that one central mistake, tricking Yudhishthira, knowing that despite the fact that he was the embodiment of dharma, still some flaw is there, some weakness was there. And it was exploited to the fullest. And all the misery that followed, culminating in this war, this war ultimately became a war about justice. And the players were necessary. Now, don't forget, in these days of warfare, it's more like a chessboard. So you have people on the one side, people on the other, and it's a contest. And you do your duty. So if you're Bhishma or Drona, you're doing your duty. It's not that you are have the idea that you are fighting for right or something like that. You're simply doing your duty, and you evaluate your duty properly. And the main criteria for it is what you are doing, is this activity enhancing your freedom or lessening it? Not only your freedom, but the freedom of others. Because your own freedom is dependent on a generosity of spirit. And Bhishma, such a great hero, lying on his bed of arrows, waiting, and with such beautiful, wise words flowing from his mouth. Without this scene, we don't have these great, great, profound words that can be life-changing for many. You get the idea? So here's the criteria. Dharma is derived from this root, which implies the thing that knits and brings together things in harmony. It's a wonderful, wonderful definition. What can we do and what can we think that brings mind and body and society into harmony, humanity into harmony? And adharma, of course, is the opposite. When you confuse these two, have confused understanding, it is a rajasic type. Supposing you find somebody noble and they behave in a rajasic way, we're not making a moral judgment on it, by the way. We're simply saying that this rajas is there, this tamas is there, this sattva is there. The aim is to be more thoroughly sattvic. And we get the freedom in a minimal way. The minimal qualification it will be, as I mentioned probably last week, 51% sattva, 49% other things. And you will never get 100% sattva. Otherwise, your life is not, you cannot operate. All three are necessary. If you don't have tamas, you won't sleep. So all of these things are necessary, no doubt. But sattva needs to dominate the psyche. And in dominating, it dominates our actions too. There are many examples where this dharma and adharma are confused. And it is only because they are raised to the intellectual level, superficial level, and primarily egoistic level. It is the egoistic element of it that makes the wrong judgment. So, I have seen, for example, religious institutions who might look for a venue for not having a venue of their own, religious and cultural institutions under the name of religion, who look for a venue not considering the ethical implications of such a thing, not considering the reputation of those who are lending the facility. Thinking that it doesn't matter as long as the end result is obtained. And many lies are told. You heard of the phrase white lie, but satyam yajati, truth alone triumphs. There's no such thing. Is there such a thing? Strictly speaking. And then, of course, we find this example I've just mentioned of Duryodhana, who's enticing Yudhishthira to gamble. I have come across many people, some people anyway, who were in business and went into a business partnership. And in 2008, when things didn't go well and many businesses had to go into liquidation, the partner, having no written agreement, just on the basis of goodwill and handshake, turned around and said, well, you can shoulder the losses. I'm off and I'm going to form my own business. Leaving the person with not only their debts, so when you form a partnership, 50-50 partnership, then the agreement is surely that you take the rewards and you take the downsides too. You take the losses and the gains, both, and it's equally shared. So these are some examples, really, of where this the dharma confusion come in. And the key is the egoistic activity of it. As long as the egocentric motive is there, then it won't be the correct thing to do. As long as the welfare of everybody is there, and the idea is that we do all activities to knit everything into harmony, as long as that is there, there's no egocentricity about it. Working for the welfare of all beings, this is how we judge it, and making sure things work in harmony, understanding that only man has the capacity with this intellect to transform disharmony into harmony. It's a kind of game that you can play. You take a philosophical approach to say that with all the disappointments and difficulties of life, can we not see things as God sees them? Can we not try to catch a glimpse of the wiring of, say, a Jesus or a Buddha or Ramakrishna? Let us take a situation, a scene. There's a country under foreign occupation, colonialism, if you will, that has no regard for your culture and religion, that oppresses the people, and that exploits the wealth of the country under the colonial rule. That in your society, there are people suffering from diseases such as leprosy, mental aberrations, poverty. You have a person, what will you do? Will you fight for the justice? Or will you see things in such a way, such a different way, that you restore harmony by your very presence? What a wonderful thing. A light that shines in such a way that it shares its radiance everywhere and has a transforming effect. With all the negativity around the environment, taking all of that as raw material, we have the capacity to transform it into something harmonious. That we call dharma. The famous story that I probably have told about 1,000,000 times. For that reason, I can tell it again. And so you see about the farmer who had to go through his field. I think you know the story well. To get water, and the farmer had to go through a kind of maze, a kind of ambush maze on a daily basis, because the neighbor at every opportunity would ambush the farmer, knowing he had to go and collect water, and he'd ambush him with cow dung, and he never knew from what direction it would come. Sometimes this neighbor with this curious sense of humor would hide behind a stone, sometimes up a tree, sometimes behind a series of rocks, sometimes behind a bush. But sure enough, the bucket of cow dung went over the neighbor, over the farmer, and the neighbor would laugh and run off. After 1 year of this, a knock on the neighbor's door, and the farmer was there, holding a rose flower. Rather cautiously, the neighbor opened the door. Yes, he said, well, you see, all that cow dung you gave over the year, I managed to plant a rose garden. Now I'm exporting roses, and this beautiful rose is a product of it. I'd like to give it to you on one condition. What is that? Says the neighbor. This coming year, please, will you double the quota? So you see, with all the cow dung of life, we can take this, and our art is to transform it. And we are the only creatures who can transform this discord into harmony. Why should we not play this game? So this is the game of dharma. So those who don't understand that, who have an egoistic point of view, will have a distortion of this morality. And I have to remind you of Swami Vivekananda's beautiful, beautiful definition of what morality is. So that activity, that thought and activity that gives the maximum strength to all inclusively, is the highest moral position. And I think it's such a wonderful definition that you can test it out in any dilemma. Where there's a moral dilemma, where you are faced with a set of objective moral rules. Of course, morality is both objective and subjective. Subjective ones we leave aside. But there are some objective moral values that are designed to, when upheld, keep things in harmony. Laws. This is why dharma has multiple meanings, meaning law, meaning religion, meaning activity connected with harmony, morals, ethics, moral behavior. But if we take this as a law, there seems to be some moral law. So it's to understand this and stick by it with the widest possible feeling for the maximum strength everywhere, all inclusively, including yourself. And there are many examples of that. You know, there's the golden rule, I think I mentioned before. Some people say the golden rule is, he who has all the gold makes the rules. No, but the golden rule is, broadly speaking, do unto others as they would have do unto you, and every religion has some version of it. The Mahabharata has a wonderful version because it inserts the word pain. Do not do unto others what would cause pain unto you. So supposing you stick with the legalistic way of the golden rule and say, do unto others as they would have done to you, the heroin addict would have us all inserting a needle full of heroin in ourselves. But if it's causing pain, that's where we draw the line. So how does this activity of, say, a heroin addict affect the strength of all? Firstly, it weakens the person who's taking it. Secondly, it weakens the whole of society that has to support them. We have to, it weakens the economy. Taxpayers' money has to go into supportive programs. So all of these tends to weaken all around. What is the strong thing to do? Of course, with every addiction, a counter-addiction has to take place. This is what we're talking here. Supposing we are addicted in love with God, supposing we take our personal chosen ideal, our personal God, and invest all our love in that. Supposing that happens, you see. So not only is it will it imbue us with a whole saturation of this sattva quality, but all the other negativity will go away. And we will strengthen ourselves and all others. Now we'll just finish off lastly with the last one, and we'll go into it in some more detail next week. But the tamasic aspect has to be now described. So adharmam dharmam iti ya manyate tamasavrata salvartan viparitamscha bhutihi sa partha tamsi. That which is enveloped in darkness regards adharma as dharma and views all things in a perverted way. That intellect, O partha, is tamasic. There are many, many examples of that. For example, let us take some simple ones close to home. Don't forget, there's a shifting landscape, these gunas. Supposing you led a good and useful life, but you're old and your family decide to do the inharmonious thing and put you into an old age home where you lose interest in life, and you then become essentially nothing more than hooked in, attached to sleep, for example, and your interest in life has gone. This is a very simple, very homely example of the kind of intellect which is tamasic. So, enveloped in darkness, we have to understand that tamas is darkness. And darkness means coverings of ignorance over knowledge, increasingly. And so, whereas other people understand the moral law, what is good and what is not good, what is moral, what is immoral, what is ethical, what is unethical, even broadly speaking, these people will switch it around. An example of this, of course, would have been Ravana. An example of this is actually Dhritarashtra. And the story is very clever because he was physically blind, but he was also blind to the merits of settling things. He had great stubbornness. So he was entrenched with this aspect. But this aspect of quietism is there inherently within people. And we can find examples of people who gave up life, who thought that it was better to live, say, on social welfare. I've come across many people where the social welfare system is rife, who say, I won't look for a job because I earn more money on social welfare than I do in working. Imagine. You know, Zimbabwe has very enterprising and active people, even though there's over 90% unemployment. But everybody is enterprising and working. Supposing they decided that they won't do it, then that means they would starve in that case. Of course, they're active, but it should be pointed out that there are some people on what you call the gravy train in the government, in any government, of course, for that matter, who then think that it is good to be lazy. Sometimes people present it as an ideal. Wouldn't it be nice to sit on a desert island with blue sky and wafting breezes and do absolutely nothing for the rest of your life and go into a kind of stupor, as it were? You see, a kind of permanent sleep, thinking that it is enlightening and peaceful, and it is not. We'll discuss a little bit more of that next week, and then we'll go on to the question of firmness of the mind in these three varieties, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, and why it's important that in order for us to make the intellect strong and make sure it makes the right choices, it requires resolve. I came across somebody, was it yesterday, who said, please tell me, how can I curb my appetite and not eat so much? I said, just stop eating. Yes, but is there an easy way? Well, you have to have a resolve. You have to have enough reason to do it. And if you don't have that, if you don't have that firmness of conviction, then you'll continue as you have always continued. All of this, of course, is to do with changing habits. And so with that, we also have to introduce the practical element that between now and next week, read these passages for yourself, study them, listen to them, meditate on them, and find out how your mind can be more sattvic as a result and make the right moral, ethical, and spiritual choices. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.